I'm Martha Dalton. I was 68 years old the day I came home from a weekend retreat and found my whole life piled on the front lawn. My rose bushes were crushed under tire marks, my photo albums scattered in the dirt, my late husband's fishing rod broken in two like kindling. I thought maybe there had been a break-in or some mistake. But then I saw the note taped to the door in my son's handwriting, and I knew they'd planned it. I stood there in the heat of June, staring at the house I'd poured 4 decades into, wondering how love could vanish so cleanly before I go any further. Let me know where you're listening from in the comments, and tap that like and subscribe button if you've ever been forced to start over when you least expected it. I grew up in a little town outside Springfield, Illinois. My daddy was a mechanic. My mama worked the early shift at the bakery. We didn't have much, but we had enough, and we were taught to be kind, not just polite, but truly kind. The kind of kindness that picks up someone else's slack and doesn't ask for thanks. I carried those lessons with me my whole life, through college, through marriage, through raising my son. My husband George and I bought that house in 1983. Back when interest rates were through the roof, and we had to stretch every dollar he'd come home from the lumberyard tired and sunburned, and I'd be in the kitchen, making cornbread, or pulling laundry off the line. We were never rich, but we were steady, and that house 2 stories cream siding. Little red shutters was our reward. We raised our son Thomas, there. He learned to walk on those hardwood floors. He scraped his knees on that cracked front step. He said his first prayer in that upstairs bedroom, while George sat on the edge of the bed, holding his hand, when George passed away 12 years ago. I stayed put. People said I should downsize, but I couldn't bear the thought. The house held every chapter of our life together. I kept it clean, kept the garden blooming, kept the kettle warm, just in case Thomas ever dropped by. He married a few years later, a woman named Melanie Pretty. On the outside, always had a comment tucked behind a smile. But Thomas loved her, and I kept quiet, like I'd been raised to when they had their son Riley. They asked if I could watch him after school while they worked late. I said yes, without thinking, gave up my part-time job at the craft store, packed away my quilting frame so I'd have more room for toys every afternoon. He'd come bounding through the door, cheeks flushed from the school bus, breathless with stories and crumbs in his backpack. It was the best part of my day. I gave up a lot those years. The girls' trip to Lake Tahoe. I'd been planning the cruise brochures still stuck in my nightstand drawer. The savings I loaned Thomas when his business hit a rough patch. I never asked for it back. It was just what family did. So when I left for that retreat with my church group that weekend, I never once imagined coming back to find my lilac pots shattered, my belongings dumped like garbage, and a note that read, "I'm sorry, Mom. My wife's parents are moving in with us. There's no room for you anymore. I hope you understand." I stood there, holding that note in both hands while the neighbors watched from their porches. No one said a word, not even Mr. Holbrook, who used to bring me tomatoes from his garden. My hands were shaking so badly I had to sit down right there on the curb beside a box of Riley's drawings and my old church shoes. I don't remember how long I sat there. I just know that when the front door opened and Thomas peeked out, his face looked like a stranger's behind him. Melanie crossed her arms and said, "You've had your time here. My parents deserve comfort in their old age." I looked down at my hands. Those same hands that had held her newborn son. Fed him. Bathed him. Comforted him. I picked up my suitcase. One bag that was all they'd left me, and I walked away. What they didn't know was, I still had one key they'd forgotten about and a storage folder they'd never seen tucked in the back of my closet. I didn't know it then, but that folder would become the start of everything that came next. I walked nearly 3 miles that afternoon before I let myself sit down. There was a bench at the edge of Riverside Park, painted green, peeling at the edges. I held onto my suitcase with both hands like it might float away if I let go. Around me, the world moved like nothing had happened. Children chased each other in the grass. A man fed pigeons with a paper bag crumpled in his lap. And somewhere nearby, a car alarm chirped before cutting off. I sat still. My hands were still smudged from picking my photo albums out of the dirt. One of them had pages stuck together from the sprinklers. The fishing rod George used to take out to Oak Hollow Lake had snapped clean at the middle. I'd left it behind. The breeze smelled like dry grass and lilac. For a moment, I could almost feel Riley's small hand tugging at my sleeve, asking if we could stop for ice cream. That was just a few weeks ago. He'd handed me a drawing of a castle and told me it was where I should live when I got old. He didn't know then that his mother already had plans for the house he made that drawing in. I stayed on the bench until the sun dipped behind the tall buildings and the park lights flickered on. My thoughts moved slow and cloudy, like I'd been swimming too long underwater. But every so often, a detail would push through. Her voice, the way she crossed her arms. The joke she made last Christmas about turning the shed into a spa when we finally make this house ours. I had laughed then. I even offered her more mashed potatoes. I'd always thought of myself as practical. I didn't ask for much. I kept the place clean, paid the bills on time. I never wanted to be a burden. When Thomas asked for help with rent during that slow season at work, I gave it without question. When Melanie needed a break, I kept Riley for a full weekend. I canceled plans with my church group more times than I could count because someone needed me. Now they needed space. That's what she said. We need the space. Not a conversation. Not even a warning. Just a door closed in my face and a note that told me everything I needed to know. The next morning, I found a little diner tucked behind the pharmacy downtown. It smelled like scorched coffee and bacon grease, the kind of place with laminated menus and a bell on the door that jangled when I stepped inside. I took a booth in the corner and wrapped my hands around a chipped mug, though I didn't drink a drop. I don't know how long I sat there before I heard someone call my name. Martha. I looked up slowly. Janet Kimball stood at the edge of the booth, holding a paper bag and wearing the same windbreaker she used to wear to the HOA meetings. She slid into the booth before I could say a word. I thought that was you, she said, eyes scanning my face. You okay? I opened my mouth, but no words came out. She reached over and squeezed my hand. Just that a soft, steady hold. That small act made something crack just under my ribs. They kicked you out, didn't they? She asked, lowering her voice. I'm so sorry. I swallowed hard. I wasn't going to say anything, she went on, but I overheard Melanie at the farmer's market last month. She was talking to someone near the honey stand, telling them they were waiting for the paperwork to go through. I didn't understand it then, but she said they'd be ready to list the house as soon as you were gone. She paused, watching my face. She said it like it was already decided. The mug in my hands felt hot again. My knuckles turned white around the handle. She said they needed the money to pay off her parents' debts. Said it'd be easy since you were... What was it? Oh, so trusting. Like you wouldn't notice until it was too late. I didn't say anything. Just let my breath out slow. I wanted to tell you, Janet said, voice shaking now. But I didn't know how. I nodded. My voice came back as a whisper. They loved the money more than me. Janet looked at me for a long time, her mouth drawn tight with anger she didn't try to hide. What are you going to do? I didn't answer right away. I felt my chin lift almost on its own. I'm going to get my life back. That afternoon, I walked all the way downtown, past the places where George and I used to shop for groceries, past the florist where he bought me daisies for our anniversary. My legs ached, but I kept going. When I reached the old brick building just off 9th Street, I stopped in front of the door. The sign above read Studio 7. Most people didn't know it was there. It used to be an art space, a community project I'd helped out with years ago before Riley was born. The woman who ran it back then had offered me a tiny staff apartment in the back in exchange for managing supplies and cleaning up. After George passed, I kept paying the minimum to hold on to the unit just in case I ever needed a place to breathe. I let myself in. The key still worked. Inside, everything was just as I remembered, dusty plain, but quiet. A twin bed under the window, a chipped sink, and a narrow table with mismatched chairs. It wasn't much, but it was mine. I dropped the suitcase by the door and sat down. The floor creaked under my feet, and for the first time in 2 days, I let myself exhale fully. No demands, no tension in the air, just silence. And in that silence, George's voice came to me again. Quiet doesn't mean weak, Martha. Don't forget that. I stood up, crossed the room, and pulled a battered accordion folder from the bottom of the suitcase. Inside were papers I hadn't looked at in years, tax forms, insurance statements, notarized documents. I flipped until I found the deed. My name. Still there. I sat down and opened my phone, scrolled through the old contacts. When I found Richard's number, I let my finger hover for just a moment before I tapped it. He answered on the second ring. Martha, everything okay? I took a breath. I think I need your help, I said. Can you meet me tomorrow? He didn't ask why, just said, of course. That night, I didn't sleep much. I made tea on the little stove and sat by the window with my notebook. I flipped to the back and found George's handwriting, his list of repairs from years ago, his notes about the mortgage payments, even a few legal names scribbled down for reference. He always kept everything in order. I read every line. I highlighted names. I circled phone numbers. When I finally put the pen down, my hands weren't shaking anymore. The next morning, I put on my old coat and walked to a small cafe near the courthouse. It was early. Not many people inside. I chose a table by the window. Richard arrived not long after, wearing a weathered blazer and carrying his old briefcase. He looked at me and nodded slowly. You look different, he said, settling into the seat across from me. I smiled faintly. I feel different. I pulled out the papers and laid them on the table. We worked through them together, my name on the deed, my rights as a co-owner, the recent changes I'd signed without thinking. His pen moved quickly. He flipped pages, marked passages. They can't sell it without your consent, he said. You still hold the authority. I felt something shift in my chest. Not joy, not anger, something calmer, like steady ground after a long walk through mud. We'll file an injunction immediately, he said. Once it's approved, they'll be barred from making any changes to the property. After that, we take back control. I looked out the window at a couple walking past with coffee cups in hand. The world hadn't stopped, but mine had started again. Richard looked over his glasses. But Martha, they're not going to like this. I nodded once. Let them come. They already took everything they could. He leaned back, watching me closely. You're not who you were. No, I said. I'm not. That night I returned to Studio 7 and began organizing everything into folders. Around 9, my phone buzzed. Thomas's name lit up the screen. I stared at it. Then I answered. Mom, he said quickly, we've been worried. Where are you? I'm fine, I said flat. A pause. Look, I think we all got a little too worked up. Maybe we could talk? I said yes. I wanted to see the look on his face when he realized he didn't know me anymore. We agreed to meet at the same diner where I'd first run into Janet. I got there 10 minutes early and chose a booth near the window. The waitress brought over a cup of tea, and I sat with both hands around the mug watching the steam curl up like breath on a winter morning. I remembered how I used to wait for Thomas at the orthodontist, sitting in lobbies with highlights magazines and too cold air conditioning. It felt like that again, except this time I wasn't waiting for a boy with a crooked smile. I was waiting for a man who decided I was disposable. They came in together. Melanie's coat still had the plastic crease from the cleaners. Thomas looked like he hadn't slept. His hair was flat on one side, and his eyes darted from face to face in the room like he wasn't sure who was watching. They slid into the booth without speaking. I didn't offer a smile. Mom Thomas began reaching across the table like he might take my hand. I folded mine in my lap and looked at him. We just wanted to say, "Things got out of hand," he said. It wasn't supposed to happen like that. Melanie jumped in quickly. "It's been a stressful few months," she said, her voice pitched low and soft. "My parents have nowhere else to go. We thought, since you're so independent, maybe you'd be all right on your own for a little while." She smiled just slightly, but it didn't reach her eyes. "We don't want to fight," she added. "We actually brought something to make things easier for everyone." She pulled an envelope from her handbag and placed it on the table. The edge of it touched my teacup. "These are the final documents," she said. "Property transfer and title release. Once you sign, everything can move forward smoothly. We can take care of the sale and make sure you're not caught up in any of the legal stuff." Thomas nodded as if her words were his, too. I looked down at the envelope. The flap wasn't sealed. I could see the signature line near the bottom of the top page. "I'll think about it," I said. Melanie blinked. Thomas hesitated. "You'll think about it." I nodded, once picked up my mug and took a sip. The tea had cooled. There was a tight silence after that. Melanie reached for the envelope, slid it back into her bag with a smile that cracked just slightly around the edges. "Of course," she said. "We knew you'd be reasonable." I finished my tea and stood. Neither of them moved to hug me. As I stepped toward the door, I heard Melanie whisper sharp and low, "She's supposed to sign today." The waitress passed me on the way out and nodded politely. I nodded back. Outside, the air was sharp and clean like the sky had been scrubbed. I walked the long way home. At Studio 7, I set the envelope on the kitchen table like it was something rotten. I didn't open it. I didn't need to. Instead, I filled the kettle and pulled down my old tin of jasmine tea. I moved slowly without rushing. The whistle started soft and rose until it echoed through the narrow space. I poured the water, steeped the leaves, and sat at the table. I reached for the photo album that had been on the lawn that first day. The one with George holding tomatoes in the backyard, Riley with a sparkler on a summer night, Thomas in his cap and gown. I looked at each face carefully. I didn't feel sorrow. I felt rooted. When the tea was ready, I sipped slowly, letting the heat spread through my chest. Then I picked up the envelope and opened it. Each page was printed with precise legal language, full of places to initial and sign. I read every word. Then I got up, walked to the drawer by the sink, and pulled out a pair of scissors. I sliced through the packet cleanly 3, 4, 5 times until the papers were ribbons. I swept them into the trash, wiped my hands on a dish towel, and went back to my tea. The next morning, just after sunrise, I called Richard. "I'd like to go over the papers again," I said. "I want to list the house." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "You're sure?" he asked. "Yes," I said, "on my terms." That day, I walked to his office. The folder with all my documents was tucked neatly in my bag. He had the coffee ready when I arrived. We sat at his desk and reviewed everything title inheritance clauses, the shared deed that George and I had set up years ago, long before Thomas ever met Melanie. "I'll contact a realtor I trust," Richard said. "We'll keep it private for now." Discreet listings. No sign on the lawn. They won't know until it's done. I nodded. It was a bright morning. I walked back through the arts district, stopping at a fabric shop with a bin of clearance bolts near the door. I picked out 3 yards of soft cotton blue cream and burgundy and carried them under my arm like groceries. Back at the studio, I cleared off the table and pulled out an old quilt top I'd started decades ago. I laid it flat, smoothed the creases, and set to work. The needle moved in and out my hands steady. There was something about the rhythm that calmed the noise in my mind. Each stitch felt like reclaiming something. By mid-afternoon, the table was scattered with thread, and the room smelled like hot tea and dust. Outside, the street was quiet, except for the occasional shuffle of footsteps and the rumble of a delivery truck. I didn't check my phone. I didn't wonder what they were doing. I just stitched. That evening, I folded the quilt neatly and set it on the armchair by the bed. I cleaned the table, washed the cup, and stood by the window for a long time, watching the lights flicker on across the alley. They hadn't called yet, but I knew they would. They always did when they needed something. And when they did, this time, they'd find out that the woman they thought they could push aside had already finished the first chapter of a different story. The house was listed quietly the next morning. Richard worked fast. He knew a realtor who specialized in private sales, no signs, no photos, no public record until after closing. We filled out the forms at his desk, while morning light slanted through the window behind him. The city was just starting to stir. A delivery truck backed up across the street, brakes squealing. Inside, we sat calm and steady, page after page. By 10 o'clock, everything was submitted. The house was on the market. "It won't take long," Richard said, pushing his glasses up. "That property's worth more than they ever realized." I nodded. My hands stayed folded on the edge of the desk. I didn't need to say much. The silence between us was enough. When I stepped outside, the air felt clearer than it had in weeks. I didn't head straight back to the studio. Instead, I walked down Main Street, past the bakery, the post office, and the park, where I used to take Riley after school. I passed the florist's shop without stopping. Then I turned up the block toward the old fabric store. The bell over the door gave a weak ring as I stepped inside. There was a bolt of navy cotton near the window that reminded me of George's old Sunday jacket. I bought 2 yards. On the way out, I picked up a tin of buttons from the discount bin and tucked them into my bag. Back at the studio, I set everything on the table and pulled out the unfinished quilt again. I hadn't touched it since before Riley was born. The stitches were uneven in places, but I could still trace the pattern. Pale blue corners, burgundy centers, cream borders. I ran my fingers over the seams for a long time before threading a needle. The day passed without a phone call. I stitched late into the afternoon, soft music playing from an old radio I found in the cabinet above the sink. I let the sound fill the space. The kettle whistled twice. I refilled my mug and kept sewing. By evening, a small stack of folded cloth sat at the edge of the table. I stood up, stretched my shoulders, and opened the window to let in the cool air. The street below was quiet, except for a woman walking a little dog and the buzz of a neon sign turning on across the alley. I didn't check my phone. The next morning followed the same rhythm. Tea quilt, soft light through dusty glass. I found myself moving slower. Not from age, but from purpose. Nothing pulled at me. Nothing needed doing for anyone else. By the end of the week, Richard called. "We have an offer," he said. "Full asking, cash buyer, and they want a fast close." I didn't hesitate. "Accept it. We'll start the paperwork," he said. "I'll schedule a final signing in the next few days." After we hung up, I sat still for a while, the phone resting in my palm. Then I folded the quilt pieces I'd finished and placed them in a shallow box. I cleared the table and swept the threads into the trash. That night, I didn't make tea. I poured a glass of water and sat by the window with the lights off, watching the city move. 3 days later, I walked into Richard's office just after 9. He was already at his desk, sleeves rolled up, a small stack of papers waiting. The room smelled faintly of coffee and fresh toner. I took my seat across from him. "These are the final documents," he said, sliding the folder toward me. "Once signed, the title transfers. The sale is irreversible. The funds go straight to your account." I opened the folder. The print was clean, the language exact. I recognized the legal terms. George had taught me how to read contracts years ago. His notes still filled the margins of an old binder I kept tucked in my suitcase. I picked up the pen and signed. The lines came out smooth. When I finished, I set the pen down gently and closed the folder. Richard leaned back in his chair. "It's done," he said. "They have no legal claim to that house anymore." I looked up at him, my voice steady. "I didn't just do this for me." He nodded. "I know." We didn't speak for a moment. The clock ticked. The hum of a copier sounded in the next room. "You're free now," Richard said softly. I left the office and walked without thinking. Turning corners I hadn't walked in years. The air was warm, the sky clear. Somewhere in the distance, a car backfired. I stopped by a vendor cart and bought a single apple. I ate it on a bench near the courthouse steps. Later that afternoon, it rained. Not hard, but steady, the kind of rain that soaks slow and quiet. Around 4, the knock came at the door of the house I used to call home. A court bailiff stood on the porch, flanked by 2 officers. His coat was damp, and he held a sealed envelope in one gloved hand. Thomas opened the door. Melanie stood behind him, arms crossed tight over her chest. "Mr. and Mrs. Dalton," the bailiff asked. They nodded. "This property has been sold," he said, unfolding the document. "You are required to vacate within 30 days. Melanie's breath caught. She reached for the doorframe like it might steady her. Thomas stared straight ahead, lips parted, eyes unfocused. The bailiff handed him the documents. The edges curled slightly from the damp. Neighbors had begun to gather under umbrellas. A few stood on their porches, others closer to the sidewalk. Mrs. Holbrook stood near the mailbox, her mouth tight. One of the Johnson boys pulled out his phone. Thomas finally spoke. This can't be right." The bailiff didn't flinch. "You may consult your attorney," he said, "but the transfer is legal and final." Melanie sat down hard on the top step. Her hands trembled. Thomas clutched the documents like they might fall apart if he let go. I watched from the far end of the street umbrella, resting lightly on my shoulder. The rain traced along my cheeks and into the collar of my coat. I didn't wipe it away. The bailiff pinned the official notice to the door with a strip of tape, then turned to leave. The officers followed without speaking. I stood a moment longer, then turned back the way I came. My steps were even. My shoulders were light. I didn't look back. Let them scramble. Let them explain. The house was gone, and this time I was the one who left without saying goodbye. I called them to meet me at a cafe on Main Street. Not just any cafe, the one with the big windows that looked out on the crosswalk, the place that always stayed crowded even in the late afternoon. I arrived early and chose a table dead center. I wore my best navy coat, the one with the wide collar and deep pockets, and pinned my mother's old pearl brooch to the lapel. I hadn't worn it since George's funeral. The hostess brought me a pot of jasmine tea and a little plate of lemon cookies. I didn't touch either one. I waited. When Thomas and Melanie walked in, they looked different. Not dressed down exactly, but not polished either. He had a hollow look around his eyes, and she clutched her purse like it was something more than a bag. They scanned the room, found me, and walked over in silence. I motioned for them to sit. Neither of them spoke. For a few seconds, all you could hear was the whir of the milk steamer behind the counter and the low hum of voices around us. I pulled a plain white envelope from my purse and slid it across the table. "These are the final legal documents confirming the sale of the house," I said. "You no longer have any claim." Thomas reached for the envelope. His hands were shaking. Melanie blinked fast and pressed her fingers to her mouth. I opened my purse again and took out a smaller envelope. "This is a check," I said. "It should cover a week at a motel and enough for food until you decide what comes next." Melanie let out a small sound, not quite a word. She turned away, face crumpling. Mascara streaked across her cheek. Thomas looked at me. Really looked. He opened his mouth to speak and closed it again. Then finally, voice low and strained, he said, "Mom, please. We didn't mean for it to happen this way. We thought—" I held up my hand. "You made your choices," I said. "You valued the house more than you valued me." Melanie sniffled hard. She tried to speak, but the words tangled. "You thought I wouldn't fight back," I said. "You were wrong." Thomas reached across the table, palm up. I pulled my hands back into my lap. "You only miss me now that I said no," I said. The table between us felt like an entire room. They didn't argue. They didn't apologize. Not really. Just sat there, unraveling. I finished my tea slowly. The room had quieted. A young woman at the next table had stopped mid-sip. A man by the counter stared into his phone but hadn't moved in minutes. When I stood up, I placed a few bills on the table to cover my tea. I didn't say goodbye. Outside, the street felt bright. The air was crisp, the kind that catches you off guard when the sun's still out but the season's turning. I took the long way around. I passed the corner bakery and looked in the window, saw rows of apple turnovers and a little girl licking icing from her finger. I didn't go straight home. Instead, I walked to Richard's office. He looked up from his desk when I stepped in. "Martha," he said, setting down his pen. "Everything all right?" I nodded. "I want to make one more change." He waited. I sat down and opened my folder. I pulled out the financial documents from the sale, the ones detailing the profit from the house, the remaining savings, everything I had left that once would have gone to Thomas. "I want to set up a trust," I said, "for women's shelters, senior housing programs, real places, people who need help, people who won't turn around and treat me like a checkbook." Richard blinked slowly. Then he smiled. "You're sure?" "Yes." He pulled a legal pad toward him and began making notes. We went through the details one by one. How much, where it would go, who would oversee it. Every time I signed a page, I felt lighter. I didn't rush. I let my pen move slowly and clearly, taking my time with every letter. When the last signature was done, Richard leaned back and exhaled. "They'll get the formal notice tonight," he said. "They won't be expecting it." I stood and gathered my bag. "Thank you," I said, voice steady. He nodded. "You did something rare, Martha." Outside, the sun was dipping low. The clouds caught its soft pink and gold spread across the sky like brushstrokes. I didn't rush home. I let myself walk slow. The sidewalks were damp from a passing sprinkle, and the gutters held little rivulets of water that caught the streetlights. That night, the envelope was delivered to their motel. I didn't have to be there to imagine it. I could picture Thomas opening it, flipping through the legalese with widening eyes. Melanie reading the letter twice before sinking to the edge of the bed. There would be no inheritance, no transfer, nothing left to fall back on. The first call came at 9:12 p.m., then 9:18, then 9:27. I didn't answer. They left voicemails pleading, then bargaining. I turned my phone over and let it buzz against the counter while I folded the quilt I'd been working on. In the morning, they showed up. I heard them before they knocked. Their voices in the hallway hushed but desperate. Then the pounding fists against the door fast and uneven. "Mom, please! We can fix this! Don't do this to us!" I stood in the kitchen and kept my back to the door. Melanie's voice cracked. "We're your family. We made mistakes, but we need you." They stayed for a while. I heard them shift pace, sit. Then the begging stopped. The hallway grew quiet. They had nowhere left to go. I knew the neighbors had started whispering. Word spreads fast when it's that kind of story. The same ones who smiled at them on summer evenings now watched from their windows. I'd overheard someone at the market saying she gave them everything, and they still put her out like she was nothing. I blocked both their numbers that afternoon, deleted the voicemails without listening. I stood at the window for a while, watching the light change over the alley. Then I sat down, unfolded the quilt again, and kept going. The pattern was nearly complete. The first few days after I blocked their numbers were quiet. No more voicemails, no knocks at the door. The studio stayed still, tucked away between the gallery and the florist. And I let the silence stretch. I finished 2 more panels on the quilt, piecing together bits of old fabric I'd kept since Riley was born. The square with the tiny sailboats had been from his first crib sheet. I stitched it into the bottom corner. I stopped watching the clock. I brewed tea when I felt like it, walked when the light looked good. One afternoon, I bought a small pot of herbs from the corner greenhouse and placed it on the windowsill. The air near the window smelled faintly of rosemary and dust. I liked it better that way. The neighbors didn't knock either, but I noticed them noticing. The woman from the bookstore across the street smiled when I passed. The mailman lingered at my box a second longer than usual. I heard whispers in the grocery store aisle, my name spoken in that soft, tilted tone people use when they're trying to piece together someone else's story. Thomas and Melanie were still at the motel. I knew because Janet called one afternoon from the payphone near the town library. "They're trying to stay quiet about it," she said, "but everyone knows." I thanked her and hung up before she could offer pity. That evening, I sat on the floor and opened one of George's old storage boxes. Inside were tax folders, mortgage records, and a stack of notes scribbled on yellow pads, his handwriting neat and underlined in blue ink. I flipped through them until I found the paper with his old estate planning notes. He'd written a line across the bottom that I hadn't seen before. It said, "Don't let them mistake your silence for weakness." I folded the note and slipped it between the pages of my journal. The next morning, I visited the bank. I'd scheduled the appointment the night before, just before closing. The branch manager led me to a private office with darkwood trim and a small vase of carnations on the windowsill. We went over the final disbursement from the house sale. The full amount sat in a holding account waiting for direction. "I want to convert the full balance," I told her. "Set up a charitable trust. Elder support. Women's housing. I've already got the documentation. My attorney's preparing the rest." She blinked once, then nodded. We went through each form slowly. I initialed where I needed to. Signed the full authorization. I didn't rush. When the last signature was done, she shook my hand. "It'll be finalized in the next 24 hours, she said. "Would you like to receive confirmation by phone or mail?" "Mail is fine." I walked out without a receipt. Later that night, a courier delivered an envelope to their motel. I knew the exact time because Richard sent me a message just after it was confirmed. Inside the envelope was a copy of the trust paperwork and the legal statement informing them they were no longer beneficiaries of any portion of my estate. No money. No fallback. No soft landing. I didn't wait by the phone. I didn't need to. The first knock came the next morning. It was early, just past 7. The hallway outside the studio echoed with footsteps, then silence, then a single knock. Soft, uncertain. Mom Thomas's voice barely carried through the door. "We just need to talk. Please." I didn't answer. A second knock, then Melanie's voice, rough and hoarse. "We're sorry. We didn't mean for things to go this far. We need help." I stood at the kitchen counter and poured myself a cup of tea. Outside the window, the florist was unlocking her door. A city truck rumbled past, trailing the scent of diesel. Thomas tried again. "I know we made mistakes, but you're our family. Please don't shut us out." Another pause. Melanie whispered something I couldn't make out. Then louder. "We're not asking for everything. Just something. Anything." I opened the cabinet and took down the little tin of sugar. The lid creaked as I lifted it. I heard them shift on the other side of the door. Melanie again. "Think of Riley. That name." For a moment, I stopped pouring. My hand rested against the rim of the cup. Then I set the tin down and walked to the window. I didn't move until I heard the footsteps retreat. Later that afternoon, I walked to the market. The wind had picked up and the leaves scattered across the pavement in dry circles. At the register, I saw Mrs. Holbrook near the dairy aisle. She looked at me, then away, then back again. They thought no one would say anything, she said low, almost to herself. I gave a small nod and kept walking. On the way home, I passed a man repairing the railing outside the dry cleaners. His radio played something old and tinny. I didn't recognize the song, but the rhythm stayed with me the rest of the walk. When I got home, I checked the mail. Nothing from them. No letter. No apology. Just the final bank statement confirming the transfer had gone through. The envelope was thin, sealed clean across the back. I sat by the window and opened it. The numbers were clear. The trust was real. The money was gone, at least to anyone who thought they had a right to it. I folded the letter and placed it beside George's note in my journal. Then I went back to my quilt. The final panel weighted soft white cotton, blank and square. I threaded the needle and pulled it through once, then again, slow and even. The door stayed quiet the rest of the evening. The calls didn't stop even after the motel visit. They tried different numbers. Voicemails came in under new contact names, unknown, private, urgent. I stopped opening them. I'd already blocked the two that mattered. I unplugged the landline in the studio. Let the silence stretch. Later that week, I passed a neighbor on the steps outside the florist. He tipped his head slightly, said nothing, just watched me walk by. I'd seen that look before, back when George got sick, and everyone around us went quiet, unsure of what to say. But this wasn't sympathy. This was something else. A quiet kind of respect. I hadn't seen Thomas or Melanie since the cafe. The eviction had done its part. The motel was only temporary. Word got around that they'd been asking about short-term rentals, but no one had offered. People remembered things, especially in a town like this. It didn't take much. That Friday, I dropped by Richard's office just after lunch. He was finishing a call and waved me in. The desk was clean except for a small stack of paperwork and a ceramic mug half full of cold coffee. "I've reviewed the trust filings," he said. "Everything's in motion. The transfer is permanent, fully notarized, and outside contest." I nodded. "They can consult a dozen attorneys," he said, "but it won't change anything." "I know." He leaned back in his chair. "You want me to respond if they try to go through me?" "No. Let them learn what silence feels like." He closed the folder gently. "I hope you're sleeping better." I gave a small shrug. That evening, I walked to the park near the old school. It was the same one where Riley had played tag with the neighbor kids and fed ducks with George. I sat on a bench near the edge of the pond and watched the sky turn from gray to orange. A boy with a red jacket ran past, laughing. His mother followed behind, arms full of snacks. I stayed until the wind picked up and the streetlights clicked on. On my way back, I passed the cafe where we'd met the last time. The same hostess stood behind the counter, wiping glasses. She caught my eye and nodded once. I kept walking. The next morning, the knock on the door came early. Not frantic this time. Measured. A single pause between each rap. I didn't answer. I heard Thomas's voice lower now. "I know you're there. Please, Mom." A beat of silence. "We didn't understand how much it meant to you. We thought we could handle it, but it's all falling apart." Melanie spoke next, quieter. "We're scared. We're trying. But we don't know where to go." I stood in the center of the kitchen and let the tea kettle whistle. I didn't turn the burner off until it boiled over. Thomas's voice again. "I can't believe I let it get this far. I didn't think you'd really leave us behind." Another pause. "We need help." The hallway stayed quiet after that. I set the kettle aside and made my tea. Then I opened the window and let the steam drift into the air. The herbs on the sill had started to stretch toward the light. That afternoon, I walked to the library, checked out a book I hadn't read in years, a novel I used to keep by the bed when George worked night shifts. I tucked it under my arm and stopped at the bakery for a fresh roll. On the way back, I passed their old house. It didn't look different, not yet, but the curtains were gone. The porch light had been left off. A no trespassing sign leaned against the fence, still curled at the corners from the rain. Mrs. Holbrook stood in her yard across the street trimming her rose bushes. "She dropped a pie off on your porch once," she said when she noticed me. "That daughter-in-law of yours." I remember it had a store sticker still on the bottom. I smiled politely. She brushed a few petals from her sleeve. "They treated you like an afterthought, but it didn't turn out like they hoped, did it?" I didn't answer. She didn't need one. That night, I lit a single candle on the table and finished the last quilt panel. It was pale yellow, plain, no pattern. I sewed it slowly, the stitches even and tight. When I was done, I folded the quilt carefully and placed it at the foot of the bed. The studio was quiet. No knocking, no calls. Just the steady hum of the refrigerator and the soft sound of city traffic outside. I turned off the light, lay down, and pulled the quilt up to my chest. The seams were smooth beneath my hands. It had taken me months to finish, but every thread was mine. The next morning, I stepped out onto the porch with a cup of tea and watched the early sun spill over the rooftops. The hydrangeas were starting to bud again, even the ones I thought wouldn't come back. I sat there a long time, listening to the quiet feeling, the kind of stillness that only comes after the noise has passed. No more calls, no more pleading, just the hum of the street and the warmth of the mug in my hands. A week later, I stopped by the community center to drop off a stack of old books. They were holding a food drive, and someone had pinned up a flyer asking for help with afternoon tutoring. I jotted down my name before I left. On the walk back, I passed a house with a woman standing in the driveway struggling to carry in groceries while her toddler tugged at her coat. I offered to help. She didn't ask who I was or why I stopped. She just smiled, and we carried the bags inside. Later that evening, I sorted through the last of the boxes from storage. I found Riley's drawings folded carefully in the bottom of one still crayon bright after all this time. One had a little house with a chimney and big windows, and in the corner, a small figure with white hair and glasses. I tucked it into a fresh frame and placed it on my desk. I didn't know when I'd see him again, or if I would, but I wanted that picture nearby. Word eventually reached me through a friend at church. Thomas and Melanie were staying in a rental on the edge of town. Small place, short lease. He was looking for work. Her parents had gone back to Arizona, and from what I heard, they didn't offer to take them in. I didn't reach out. Not yet. Sometimes the silence says more than any words ever could. There's a kind of peace that comes when you stop waiting for someone else to do the right thing. When you stop begging to be treated gently and start choosing gentleness for yourself. It doesn't mean there aren't days when the ache returns when I set 2 plates out without thinking or glance at the door expecting a knock that never comes. But it's different now. The grief doesn't rule the room anymore. It just sits quietly in the corner, letting me breathe. I've started planting again. Not just herbs this time, but tomatoes, snap peas, even some zinnias. I take my time with it. I don't rush. There's a calmness in slow things. Soil under the fingernails. Clean sheets drying on the line. A handwritten letter folded twice and slipped into an envelope with care. Justice, I've learned, isn't always loud. Sometimes it looks like walking away and letting the walls fall in behind you. Sometimes it's standing still, while the ones who hurt you unravel on their own. And sometimes it's just knowing you kept your kindness intact when everyone else forgot theirs. If you're still here listening, thank you for sitting with me through the hard parts, the quiet parts, the parts I never thought I'd say out loud. And if any part of this reminded you of something in your own story, I hope you give yourself permission to hold on to what's good and let go of what isn't. If you'd like to share where you're listening from, I'd love to hear it. And if you know someone who needs a reminder that it's never too late to start again, send this their way. I'll be right here on the porch, watching the garden grow.